Good afternoon. Hello and welcome, everyone. Thanks for joining us for the launch of the 2023 edition of TAF's GTHA Carbon Emissions Inventory. My name is Akash Sherpalani, and I will be your moderator for this afternoon. First off, I'd like to acknowledge the land on which many of us are gathering virtually, referred to by settlers as the Greater Toronto and Hamilton area. Indigenous people have lived here for thousands of years, including the Huron-Wendat, the Haudenosaunee, Erie, Neutral, Anishinaabe, Mississaugas of Scugog Island First Nation, Chippewas of Georgina Island First Nation, and the Mississaugas of the Credit First Nations. This land is governed by the Dish with One Spoon Covenant, a treaty which bound these groups in sharing this territory and protecting the land. Subsequent Indigenous nations and peoples, Europeans, and all newcomers have been invited into this treaty in the spirit of peace, friendship, and respect. And I would also like to acknowledge that our colleague Ekaterina, is located on the traditional lands and territories of the Kwikwetlen, Tsleil-Waututh, Musqueam, Squamish, Kikite, and Stolo nations, referred to by settlers as the village of Anmore. Some quick housekeeping before we get started. You'll notice there are two buttons below. Please use the chat to introduce yourself and where you're calling in from, as well as any general comments you might have throughout the presentation. And if you have questions for our panelists, please do use the Q&A function at the bottom during any time during the presentation. So please use the Q&A function, not the chat function. Otherwise, we might miss it. And we've set aside some time for answering questions at the end of the presentation. And don't worry about furiously trying to take notes. We will be sharing the slides as well as a recording of the webinar by email to everyone that's registered for today's presentation. So for those of you who don't know who we are, the Atmospheric Fund is a regional climate agency that invests in low carbon solutions for the Greater Toronto and Hamilton area and helps bring them to scale in several different ways. And I'm just looking to see if the slide can move to the next one. Next one from there. Great, thank you. So it's my pleasure to introduce my colleagues, the folks behind the report and recommendations we'll be walking through today. Ekaterina Sakova, Patrick Ronan, Brian Purcell, and Mariam Shakarsvard. And with that, I will pass the baton over to Ekaterina, who will kick off the presentation with an overview of the 2023 results. Take it away, EK.
Thanks, Akash. Before we get into the numbers, I wanted to provide a bit of context to our inventory work. We started tracking carbon emissions across the region back in 2015 with the purpose of understanding where we need to focus as an organization. And we also wanted to share that information. We track emissions across 5 sectors and across all 6 regions in the Greater Toronto and Hamilton area. And every year we make updates. We try to improve. We look at adding more data. We look at how we present the data. And a big focus this year was providing city level data. Like most inventories, we include scope 1 and 2 emissions, but in a number of places, we also look at scope 3 emissions, things like embodied carbon of key building materials, aviation emissions, and fugitive methane emissions. And another unique thing about our publication is that we provide a series of recommendations, which Brian will speak to in a few minutes, that really highlight where we need to make changes to reverse some of the trends that you're going to see today. Next slide. So in 2023, carbon emissions across the GTHA increased by 2%, reaching 54.5 million tons. While this might seem like a small increase, it's directly in contrast with the 11% annual decrease we now need across the region to hit our future targets. Total emissions, we saw increase across all regions and almost all sectors. And what's driving these increases is largely the transportation sector, which accounts for over 1/3 of our emissions, as well as the increased amount of natural gas generation, driving up the carbon intensity of the electricity grid. Next slide. Here you can see a graph of historic emissions and where we currently sit. And other than the progress made during the coal phase out, mostly between 2005 and 2015, we continue to see very little sustained progress across the region in reducing emissions. So we're now effectively back at 2019 emission levels, eroding a lot of the reductions we saw happen during the pandemic. And if we continue on the pathway, you can clearly see where we could end up being, which is pretty far away from our net zero targets. And to get back on track, I mentioned that number, that 11% decrease on average per year. That's going to be key. We need to sustain that through population growth that is expected to continue across the region. Next slide. Now, diving deeper into the results, we saw that emission profile stayed pretty similar to past years, with the building sector and specifically the amount of natural gas used for space heating and domestic hot water still being the top source of emissions across the region. Our analysis shows that there were increases across all the sectors, except for the building sector, which decreased by about 0.6%. And that decrease that we're seeing is largely because of the milder winter we had in 2023, which reduced the need for as much natural gas for space heating. The next biggest source of emissions is transportation, and that's specifically the use of gasoline and diesel fuel. And emissions here have effectively returned to pre-pandemic 2019 levels. And then we have industry, waste, and agriculture making up the remaining emissions in the region. Each of those sectors had moderate increases. Steel in Hamilton, cement in Durham, and Peel are still dominating industrial emissions. And I did want to point out that in terms of food, the majority of food consumed within the GTHA is produced outside the region. So that's not reflected in that agricultural bubble that you see on the slide. Next slide. The regions here, you can see the spread of total emissions across the map. These are not adjusted for population. And in terms of total emissions, we saw increases anywhere from 0.8% in Halton to almost 3% in Hamilton. Per capita emission changes were a little bit more nuanced. They decreased in Durham, Halton, Peel. Each of those had about a percent decrease. Toronto went down about 2.6%. While York and Hamilton had pretty small increases that were largely driven by sort of a bigger transportation emissions. Next slide. Next slide. And for the first time this year, we're tracking emissions down to the city level. Now, there's a lot of data here that you see. It's a pretty busy slide, but don't worry, you don't need to memorize this. We're going to be providing all this information on the region pages of our website, as well as in the downloadable files. And what we wanted to show here visually was the spread of emissions at a more granular city level. There are some differences between individual cities and trends, especially when it comes to transportation, but overall, most cities follow their respective regions' trends. And if you're city staff and you see an asterisk next to your municipality, that means that we need your help in getting either natural gas or electricity data. So please get in touch with us after this webinar. Next slide. So I want to spend a bit of time talking about buildings. As mentioned, buildings make up the majority of our emissions, which predominantly comes from natural gas used for space heating and natural gas plants used to generate electricity. Total building emissions decreased, and per capita building emissions also decreased by a slightly larger amount, 3.6%. And there's a few reasons for those changes. One, we had a warmer winter. We also saw some improvements due to retrofits. We've taken a closer look at the energy and water reporting and benchmarking data, and we found that weather normalized energy consumption, particularly for larger buildings, dropped by almost 4% over the last couple of years, which is good. Overall, weather normalized natural gas emissions, specifically in 2023, decreased by about 1.5%, which is definitely a positive trend after the last few years of increases. And generally speaking, we saw some of the largest decreases specifically in the residential building sector and to a smaller extent, the commercial sector. With that, I'll pass things on to Pat to discuss the electricity side.
Great. Thanks a lot, Katrina, and good afternoon, everyone. Next slide, please. So electricity emissions in the GTHA have been steadily rising over the last several years, and in 2023, this upward trend continued, reaching 3.9 megatons of electricity emissions. So that's a pretty sizable 30% increase over 2022, where we saw 3.0 megatons. If we look just a little bit further back, we can see that emissions have just about doubled since just 2020. Now, to understand really what's causing electricity emissions to rise, we need to consider the underlying factors that really drive these emissions. And there's really two dimensions at play here. So the first is the overall demand for electricity in the GTHA. In other words, how much electricity is being used by residents, businesses, institutions, and so on. And the second factor influencing our electricity emissions then, in addition to demand, is the carbon intensity of the electricity generation used to meet that demand. So in terms of that first item on the demand side of things, I can tell you that electricity demand in the GTHA has remained relatively stable going back to 2015. In fact, we saw a slight demand decrease in 2023 of about 1%. So clearly, the major driver behind these rising electricity emissions has not been rising demand. Instead, emissions are rising because of the increasing carbon intensity of the provincial electricity grid. So in 2023, the carbon intensity of the grid rose by 30%. This was after a 16% increase in 2022, 22% increase in 2021, and a 23% increase the year before that. So all of this just to say that our grid has become more carbon intensive in a rather short period of time. And the reason the grid has become more carbon intensive is because, well, simply put, more and more of our electricity is being produced from natural gas-fired generation. Our natural gas-fired peaker plants are running much more often than just peak periods, in large part due to ongoing refurbishments to our nuclear fleet, which will continue over the next decade, but also due to a lack of investment in alternatives to make up that gap, using resources other than gas. So the concern really is that our electricity emissions will continue to rise if we remain on our current path. Next slide, please. And to illustrate this, we have a chart here showing both historical and projected electricity emissions. Just a little note, the previous slide was showing GTHA specific electricity emissions. Here we have Ontario-wide emissions, so the numbers here are a little bit larger, but the trend and the story certainly is the same. So starting with the historical emissions on the left in the white line, we can see that emissions bottomed out in 2017 and have been rising since, bringing us up to present day in 2024. And in terms of the electricity emissions forecast then, I'd like to just take a moment to talk about uncertainty, because as many of you are likely aware, the Independent Electricity System Operator, the IESO, recently released an updated demand forecast that predicts a 75% increase in electricity demand by 2050. And then the major drivers of this new demand is EV supply chain manufacturing, along with data centers needed for the proliferation of artificial intelligence. So this means we have a sizable demand supply gap emerging in the 2030s. And the ISO has signaled it will conduct a series of energy and capacity procurements over the coming years to address this gap. But this is where we get back to the theme of uncertainty, because at this stage, we don't know what mix of resources will be used to fill that supply gap, and to what extent these resources will be non-emitting, such as wind, solar, energy storage, energy efficiency, and so on. So with that in mind, we'll take a quick look at the projection here on the right side of the chart. So this year, you may have noticed we're doing things a little bit differently. Rather than a single forecast line, we've opted to show forecasted electricity emissions as a range or a band, really to reflect that uncertainty that I spoke about, and present a range of possible pathways. So the lower boundary of this range, what we're calling the low emissions scenario, reflects the IESO's high nuclear case, as outlined in the 2024 annual planning outlook. And in this scenario, as you can see, emissions taper off in the early 2040s. And the assumption is that new demand is being met strictly with non-emitting resources. On the other hand, the upper boundary, or the high emissions scenario, is derived from the IESO's 2025 projected demand, assuming that we continue to ramp up our natural gas generation and to meet 25% of the demand supply gap each year. So really trying to show two extremes here. Now, as you probably have noticed, both of these scenarios depict a pretty steep increase over the next 3 to 4 years, so roughly a doubling. But again, I'll reiterate, this is a forecast based on current information and policies, but is not necessarily a foregone conclusion. We are at a pivotal moment where decisions that we make now around our grid will have lasting impacts on our emissions outlook. And the situation is evolving. So there is room to influence these policy decisions and mitigate these rising emissions, electricity emissions. And on that note, Brian will walk us through a few electricity-related policy recommendations in a few moments. But I'll just finish by, again, emphasizing the importance of expanding our supply of non-emitting resources, which will be critical not only to reduce, electricity emissions specifically, but to support electrification across other sectors of the economy, like transportation, for example. And with that, I'll pass the baton back to Ekaterina for a look at our transportation sector results.
Thanks, Pat. In terms of transportation emissions, those went up about 4.7%, which is not great, but it's about half of the increase we saw the year before, and definitely a slowdown of increases. Normalizing for population, as you can see on the slide, it's a much smaller increase at about 1.5%. And the changes that we saw across the region and across the cities weren't necessarily consistent. For example, transportation emissions went up considerably in places like Pickering, Ajax, Oshawa, over 10% there for all 3 cities. Other cities saw much smaller increases, like Oakville and Burlington had a few percent increase. And it's difficult to pinpoint one specific reason for the increases that we're seeing in transportation emissions, but we know that population is definitely having a direct effect, as well as the number of trips per capita, and likely continuing the impacts, we're continuing to see the impacts from return to office policies, as well as the predominant use of internal combustion engine vehicles. And I saw there was a question coming in about trip origin, destination details. That's something that we want to take a look at in closer, we want to take a look closer in future years. Next slide. And in terms of positive trends for transportation, I want to spend a few minutes talking about that. In 2023, we saw another considerable year-over-year increase in electric vehicle registrations. You can see the percentages on the left part of the slide there. And just to put that into context, we now have about 100,000 registered electric vehicles and plug-in hybrids across the region. Places like Oakville, Richmond Hill, Vaughan, Aurora, East Gwillimbury have the highest number of EVs per capita. And while overall region-wide EVs still represent a relatively small portion of cars on the road, the increases in registrations that we're seeing continue now for a few years are very encouraging. In terms of cycling and walking trips, most regions and cities experienced increases in the number of trips for both of those modes. There was a bit of a trend towards shorter but more frequent trips that we saw also happening across the region. And I do want to mention a few notable increases here. Durham saw a pretty sizable 14% increase in cycling distance and a 24% increase in number of cycling trips. York also saw some considerable increases there as well. And interestingly, Peel saw pretty big jumps in walking trips and walking distance. Last but not least, we track transit ridership for various transit authorities across the GTHA. And overall, we saw a 28% increase in ridership across the region. We're not quite where we were in 2019, but we're definitely getting close to those pre-pandemic numbers. Once again, a few notable mentions there. Durham Regional Transit reported 48% increase. Milton Transit almost doubled. They saw a really staggering 89% increase. And Metrolinx also reported really high increases, about 76% there, which is really great to see. And with that, I'll pass things on to Brian to talk about the recommendations.
Thank you, and good afternoon, everyone. So I'm going to take a few minutes reflecting on climate action priorities from a policy perspective, flowing from the analysis of the data and where emissions are coming from, and covering all three levels of government. Obviously, going to be very high level here given the time, but want to highlight some of the key actions as we see it across all levels of government. Next slide, please. So starting at the municipal level and buildings, priority number one in my mind is on green development standards for new construction. So helping, working towards making sure these are in place across the region to make sure new construction is designed to be low carbon, and updating those standards over time as we push closer to net zero ready construction, and also working with industry on compliance with the targets to make sure we're really achieving the goals set out in those standards. And there's encouraging progress on that front. We're reporting this year that 86% of the region by population is now covered by municipalities with green development standards with low carbon requirements. So that's a huge change from, let's say, 5 years ago when I was a much smaller share. So we're seeing these green standards in place across most of the region, and some great progress this year with Hamilton and Mississauga, for example, being two of the new ones this year. And so that's great. And we want to see those continue to expand and be updated and strengthening the compliance with them. But also looking at the bigger picture, of course, is the existing buildings, most of which will still be with us, through to 2050, and decarbonizing those. And that's where we'd like to see municipalities working on performance standards for existing buildings. So the City of Toronto's leading the way on this, I would say, and as well into design and consultation on a building emissions performance standard for existing buildings, medium and large buildings. And that's coming for approval sometime late next year. So we're really excited to work with them on that and hope to see that, replicated, improved on, adapted across much of the region as a key tool for driving building sector emission reductions. On the transportation side, municipalities have a key role to play on supporting electrification of transportation. And one of the key roles is around facilitating access to electric vehicle charging. So there's great uptake of electric vehicles, but we know there remain many barriers for some users. One of the most important ones being in multi-residential buildings where it can be very difficult to get access to charging where it's not available. And a huge share of the region lives in these buildings. So, for municipalities, there's many tools to use, including building into development standards or bylaws that new residential construction have EV charging readiness built in, but also looking at how municipalities can support the rollout of charging infrastructure, for example, leveraging municipally owned lands to provide a host for charging, and taking advantage of funding from senior levels of government and industry partnerships to roll that out. And of course, continuing to invest in transit and the electrification of transit as well, where as an important priority. And then on the broader planning and electricity system side, we're really encouraging municipalities to look at their zoning bylaws and other bylaws to screen and remove barriers to climate action at that level. Just a couple of examples. A lot of most municipalities understand and have built into their climate plan. Heat pump retrofits is a key tool for reducing emissions, but many municipalities, for example, have zoning restrictions that ban these devices from, for example, front yards in some cities. Outdated bylaws that nobody that we can tell actually remembers why they exist. So dealing with some of that, we see this with solar as well. Like, for example, some municipalities having bylaws that ban the use of solar in parking lots, where we'd like to see solar canopies, for example, as a good option for property owners. So really, there's some housekeeping there that municipalities can do that is a quick win. Next slide, please. Moving on to provincial policy priorities, we talked about electricity quite a bit, the fastest growing source of emissions for the region. And here there's both prioritizing development of like centralized utility scale, clean energy supply and storage, and also pursuing all cost-effective demand-side management and energy efficiency. So as we've discussed, the province is entering into a series of procurements for new energy and capacity in the electricity system. A year ago, they had announced that that would be restricted to non-emitting supply. A few months ago, they revised that policy and opened up those procurements to natural gas generation. So obviously we'd like to see that be non-emitting supply going forward, or at least giving preferential treatment to that in the procurement process, taking into account carbon emissions would be important. And we hope to see that those procurements lead to primarily non-emitting supply. But we also need to, pursue our most cost-effective resources, which is energy efficiency. We'd like to see at least a doubling in investment in energy efficiency programs and the new energy efficiency framework coming from the province later this year or early next year. And also more support for distributed energy resources and demand response within cities. On the broader building sector, there's a key role for the province on the Ontario Building Code to create that backstop for all new construction and options to extend it to renovations following the federal model code for that. And it's, and we think it's important for the province to send a clear signal on a long-term trajectory towards net zero ready in the building code. There's currently no clear commitment there to move towards that in the building code. And that creates uncertainty for industry and for energy system planning. So we'd like to see that cleaned up. And then on the transportation side, we think there's a big priority and more the province could do in supporting electric vehicle adoption. Options include, vehicle rebates. Many provinces providing this works very well to enhance adoption, but also more investment in charging infrastructure. And continuing to make larger investments to enable build out of charging infrastructure, which will encourage that enhanced adoption. Next slide, please. And moving on to federal priorities. On the electricity front, the federal government has more high-level responsibilities, so they're developing clean electricity regulations for the country that would require a gradual decarbonization of the electricity system. We'd like to see those finalized. We're expecting them, late this year, early next year, and also hoping to see those be durable and maintained over time, so that we have a clear signal in the long term of where the grid needs to go. But there's also a key role as well for the federal government to support decarbonization of electricity through funding. They've got some new tax credits for clean energy, which we think will be quite useful for promoting that in Ontario. And, more to come, we hope, in terms of funding some of the costs associated with decarbonizing electricity. On the building side, the federal government has a key responsibility for equipment and appliance standards, and we'd like to see these progressively tightened over time and eventually move towards gradually phasing out the use of the sale of fossil-fueled heating equipment. This is something many of our peer countries in the developed world are doing, setting clear regulatory timelines for phasing out fossil fuel-based heating equipment, and we think it's a key tool that should be explored in Canada. And then on the transportation front, continuing federal investments in both electric vehicle adoption and charging infrastructure. The federal government's been investing quite a lot in this, but some of those programs are nearing an end, and they need to, evolve and continue as it's just such a huge priority to transition Canadians into electric transportation options. And there's definitely a big role for the federal government in ensuring consistent access to charging across the country and making sure these vehicles are accessible and affordable for Ontarians and Canadians. And that concludes the overview of policy recommendations, and I'll turn it back to Akash.
Great. Thanks, Brian. And thank you to all of our panelists for sharing those insights. While we do acknowledge that the results are discouraging, there are plenty of tangible and proven steps we can take to really bend that curve. And that's a major reason why we pull this inventory together every year to influence those policies, those programs, those investments in the region, and to really shine a light on where we're making progress and where we aren't. And we know a number of you, based on the comments in the chat, are doing fantastic work on advancing urban climate solutions here in the GTHA. And so we really just want everyone to know that we have several tools that we can use to support cities in delivering on those climate plans, including a grants program, the first round of which will be in January for 2025. So please do reach out if you have anything that could require our support, even if it's not fully baked. We're always happy to jump on a call. And thanks everyone for the questions, and also thanks to Miriam for answering some of those throughout the presentation. We had some questions come in during registration, so maybe we'll start with a few of those, and then I'll go to the ones that were sent in during the presentation. And feel free to continue sending us questions. I'll monitor them and try to get to all of them if possible. All right, so first question here, have transportation emissions fully rebounded to 2019 levels, so pre-pandemic levels? And how's that been influenced by some of the determinant factors? So cost of fuel, the prevalence of hybrid or remote working, and the adoption of EVs. So maybe I'll give this one to Pat.
Sure, thanks, Akash. Yeah, it's a great question around the transportation sector. I think it was mentioned that this year, unlike the last few years, it was the transportation sector that really drove the emissions increase that we saw in 2023. So the answer to answer the question simply, yes, we have more or less rebounded to 2019 levels. We're, I mean, technically 98, 97% of the way there. Certainly another year of a similar sized increase, we will surpass that pre-pandemic total. Regarding some of the factors influencing this rise, I would say certainly they're all playing a part. Fuel cost, remote working, EVs, they're all impacting our transport emission trends. And as I think Ekaterina mentioned earlier, it's something we'd like to dive into deeper into the future, is to really parse out the relative contribution of these various factors. There's no doubt that return to office policies has eroded at least some of the reductions that we've seen coming out of the pandemic. However, on the positive side, we, as I think it was mentioned, we saw an increase in transit ridership, significant increases in EV uptake, more and more people opting for active transportation like walking and cycling. So yeah, with all that said, it'll be we're eagerly looking forward to next year's data and hopefully see these transportation emissions no longer rising and hopefully starting to decline. So
Great, thanks, Pat. Second question, why do we not include scope 3 emissions in our inventory? I think we touched on this briefly in the presentation, but Mary, maybe you can elaborate on our answer.
Sure, thanks, Akash. So in TAP's inventory, we include some of the scope 3 emissions, including aviation emissions, embodied carbon of building materials, natural gas fugitive emissions, and electricity transmission and distribution loss. However, due to data limitations and significant effort and resources required, we have not yet included the consumption-based emission inventory for the entire region. So this piece is missing, but for the context, City of Toronto conducted a consumption-based emission inventory for the year of 2019, about 2 years ago, and which revealed that their consumption-based emissions were 2.5 times higher than their sector-based emissions for the same year. So this comparison provides us with a sense of the scale of consumption-based emissions in the region, which is notably large.
Great, thanks, Miriam. Have retrofits made a dent in building emissions? Great question. Katrina, maybe you can provide some insight there.
Absolutely. So I talked a little bit about our deep dive with the EWRB data. And what we've seen is we've seen a couple % reduction, specifically in large buildings over the last couple of years, which is really good to see. Where, anecdotally, there's a fair amount of evidence that retrofits are obviously making a difference at the individual building and site level. But that beyond a few % difference is not sort of coming out yet when you look at building sector emissions, because we need more of those retrofits. So that's, I think, going to be really important going forward. And it's kind of touches on a number of some of the other questions we'll talk about, whether if we include all the recommendations that we've talked about today, is that going to make a dent in emissions, and specifically for existing buildings there and retrofits. That's a really, really important area. So we're seeing a little bit of a difference happen, and we'll continue to monitor, especially with the 2023 data just recently being released from EWRB. So we'll see if those trends continue, and we definitely know that we need to do more, though.
Great, thanks, Katrina. There's a question around aviation emissions, I believe. That is something we are tracking now, and maybe Pat, you can provide some detail on what we're seeing there. I believe we're tracking emissions both at Pearson and Billy Bishop.
That's right. Thanks, Akash. Yeah, we are tracking aviation emissions. We unfortunately weren't able to cover that in today's presentation for time, but we do quantify Scope 3 aviation emissions from Toronto Pearson as well as Billy Bishop City Airport. And in 2023, those combined aviation emissions from those two airports increased 25% from 2022's total. So we're at about just over 7 megatons. And in total, aviation emissions have more than tripled since 2021 when they reached their, let's call it their pandemic-induced low. Emissions from Billy Bishop have now returned to their pre-pandemic total. Pearson, on the other hand, is about 90% of the way back to the pre-pandemic emissions total. So certainly something we'll be monitoring next year and the years moving forward as well to see where things are trending. I'll also just add that those two airports are obviously not the only two airports in our region. There's obviously an international airport in Hamilton and several others airports in the region. So we would love to include, sort of expand our list of airports that we will be quantifying. Unfortunately, we weren't able to do that this year for some of the other airports just due to a lack of publicly available data, but something that is certainly on our radar. No pun intended.
Great, thanks, Pat. There's a question around the differences in data. So I believe this is referring to perhaps both sources of data as well as what we're seeing in the reported data between bigger and smaller municipalities. Maybe Katrina, you could provide some insight there.
Yeah, absolutely. So overall, in terms of data, we use the same sources of data for the regions and for the cities, except for waste emissions, which we allocate by population due to the lack of kind of detailed information on waste generation by city. Overall, I'd say there's similar trends in increases and decreases between the cities and the respective regions. So the electricity grid is impacting regions as much as it is impacting individual cities. Same thing with natural gas consumption and some of the milder temperatures that we're seeing. There are some nuances when it comes to the percent changes, so the numbers, and that's related to just the type of building stock that there are differences across cities and across regions. Transportation is another one we see a little bit of a bigger difference, especially in the increases in transportation emissions. And that's largely, related to population, and each city and region has different increases of population. But when you sort of remove that variable, you then get into kind of the origin and destination questions, which we want to explore a little bit further. And we suspect that those are having a bit more of a nuanced kind of impact when it comes to city by city. So overall, sort of the high level trends and where we're moving, there's a lot of similarities, but when it comes to the details and sort of the reasons for specific changes, there's a bit of difference.
Great, thanks, Katrina. Okay, maybe a question for Brian. How do we expedite housing density without extensive carbon? What are some practical approaches that we can actively adopt?
That's a great question. Well, I think, the step one is making the best use of what we have. The lowest carbon building is one that already exists. So looking to renovate and upgrade buildings rather than tear down where we can. Looking at, secondary suites type approach to laneway housing, these kind of approaches that can build more gentle density into existing neighborhoods. And so that's can be a very promising way to make quick action on housing, but it's not at the scale we need. Also need to look at how we can better support that missing middle of mid-rise buildings that can be integrated in more types of neighborhoods than some of the high-rise development we see in downtowns, and lend themselves more to low carbon construction in terms of both the embodied carbon emissions and also operating carbon. Really, that's the building form with the best potential to be low carbon in many ways. And but we don't see enough of that mid-rise development in a lot of our cities, and there are some specific zoning and planning type policies that could be tweaked to kind of encourage and support that. And I know a lot of municipalities are looking at that. And then more broadly, of course, we can look at integrating that embodied carbon considerations into green development standards. We're starting to see that usually in the voluntary tiers of the green development standards, requirements attached to incentives for addressing embodied carbon. It's going to take some time for that to work down into core requirements, but it's also being looked at as part of the national code development process. And I think those two combined are going to create more industry familiarity and more of a drive for the suppliers to make data available on the embodied carbon of building materials and products, and that should support low carbon construction further.
Amazing, thanks, Brian. Okay, one other question from the ones that were submitted during registration. How do TAF's emissions factors compared to that of the federal inventory report? I believe this is referring to the electricity emissions factors. Marian, maybe you can provide some more detail there.
Yeah, absolutely. So TAF uses emission factors for most of the fossil fuels, including natural gas, gasoline, diesel, and aviation jet fuel from National Inventory Report, NIR. For electricity, TAF applies emission factors derived in-house using ISO's electricity generation data. And the reason is that since 2020, we noticed discrepancies in electricity generation from natural gas generation reported by ISO and NIR. And notably in 2022, in the latest NIR report, when we compared ISO and NIR's gas generation, we noticed that ISO reported 40% more electricity generation from natural gas compared to what was reported in NIR. ISO's data is based on settlement purposes, while the NIR uses information from StatCan's facility owner survey. TAF uses ISO electricity generation data in the inventory and will continue to monitor these differences as the 2023 NIR report is being released.
Great, thanks, Mariam. All right, so question from Trevor here. Speaking to transportation emissions, so how are they calculated? And whether we use OD modeling, origin destination modeling, to determine or inform what's driving those emissions increases. I think we briefly touched on this during the presentation. but maybe I'll throw this back to Miriam as well. Do anything to add there?
Sure. We calculate the transportation emissions using fuel sales purchased from Calibrate, which surveys most of the gas stations for light duty vehicles in the region. For heavy duty vehicles in transit, we apply some scaling factors to include those as well in our transportation emissions, which we included further details in how we use those scaling factors in our methodology document in our web pages. And as EK mentioned, we have not used origin destination modeling to inform the commute and behavioral change, but something to consider for future years.
Great. Thanks, Miriam. Just checking. Can people still hear me? My headphones just died. Awesome. Okay. So we have a question around how active transportation, I believe these are the trends related to active transportation, are estimated. Katrina, maybe you can provide some insight there.
Yeah, absolutely. So we look at active transportation data, mainly the cycling and walking, using the Google Environmental Insight Explorer data. And then in terms of transit authorities, I saw there was a question around that. We look at publicly reported data from the different transit authorities across the GTHA.
Right.
And then maybe I'll just put one last note. So folks might see that there's been one update this year where we're including more transit authorities. So folks can see a bit more of a complete list on our website.
Great. And maybe I'll just tack on one other question. Kevin was asking whether the increases over 2022, or whether I believe this was related to the transportation slide, whether those increases that we were showing are relative to 2022 as opposed to absolute increases. Do you mind just clarifying?
Yeah, absolutely. So most of I would say almost all the percentages and numbers that we've talked about are changes between 2022 to 2023. So that's the same thing for transportation. The only, I think maybe total number that I talked about was the total EVs and plug-in hybrids. That's an absolute number. But I would say on the website, the same thing goes for that. So unless we have a different year, I specifically state that it's usually a 2022 to 2023 comparison.
Great. And thanks everyone for all the great questions. Please keep them coming. Okay, question for Brian. If all the 4 policies in the tracker are put in place in each city and region, so I believe these are the 4 distinct policies we lay out in the policy tracker on our website. The green development standards, existing building performance standards, electric vehicle strategies, and building retrofit programs. How much would emissions drop? So I don't know if we have a quantitative answer, but maybe you can just speak to the importance of those 4 policies and qualitatively what sort of emissions reductions we might expect to see.
Right. Yeah, I can't give a hard answer to that question. A lot depends on the stringency with which the policies are implemented and the pace at which they're implemented. Yeah. The other factor is how much of the building sector we capture with these types of policies. For example, it's not expected most existing building emissions performance standards would capture single family homes. Those would be excluded. So those need to rely on other types of programs and policies. And actually, we see the same with green development standards generally, not applying to single one-off homes, but to larger developments, whether larger buildings or subdivisions. And so, yeah, we can make a lot of progress through those policies. I can't give it an absolute answer, but certainly not all the way to the climate targets that many cities have committed to. That's really going to also need action from the other levels of government, filling in some of those gaps. Such as appliance and equipment standards, which are a great way to address emissions from single-family homes, as well as, of course, decarbonization of the electricity system, and of course on electric vehicles, like policies like the federal zero emissions vehicle sales mandate, can play a key role in making sure we get a consistent pace of vehicle electrification. So I think that's the best answer I could give right here. But if whoever asked has further questions about it, we do have access to some city level modeling of some of those policies and their impacts. So happy to see if we can share something that would be useful offline.
Great. Thanks, Brian, for that comprehensive answer. Someone did ask whether the recording of the webinar will be available online. Yes, we will be sending a copy of the slides as well as a recording of the webinar after the session to all of those that registered by email. So look out for that. Okay, Brent is asking, do we have historical municipal data to give a clearer picture of the trends by municipality? Maybe I'll throw that one to you.
Yeah, sure. We have some historical data for the municipalities, and that'll be available both on the website, but also for download in our downloadable data set. It's not a complete data set for each municipality, unfortunately, but we've made sure to include anything that we have related to municipal emissions. And that also kind of emphasizes the sort of the future-facing aspect of we want to continue to build out this robust data set of municipal emissions. And that's where many of the municipal folks on this call could help us out with that in terms of getting the data we need that we can then assemble and put out there and help help with climate decision making and planning. So yeah, in a nutshell, we do have some historical data available, and we hope to continue to build that out in the future.
Great. Thanks, Pat.
And if I could just add to Pat's great answer, that's really where we need individual municipalities' help. We can't get utility data, that's the natural gas and electricity data, without permissions from individual municipalities. So regions already know the drill. We've worked with them with a number of years, and we want to start and continue doing that with a lot of the cities. So if you see a year or sort of a cell that says not available, please get in touch with us. And the level sort of, we'll take it on. We'll sort of look at getting that data, but that permission is really what we need from city staff.
Great. Yeah. So if you're a municipality and you don't have access to the data that you'd like to see to help evaluate your climate progress, please reach out to us. Maybe I'll throw this question back to you, Katrina. Given the increasing carbon intensity of our power generation, have we looked at the change in the sort of benefit, the carbon benefit of electric vehicles over conventional internal combustion vehicles?
Yeah, absolutely. There's still a benefit, despite some of the increases that we're seeing in the electricity grid. And the same thing goes for building retrofits that involve electrification of the heating systems, the space heating systems, and domestic hot water systems. So there's absolutely the case to continue to electrify both of these sectors. But at the same time, we have to look at the grid, and a lot of the recommendations that Brian talked about at provincially and federally have to do with that. So that isn't to say that we should not focus on the electricity grid, but at this point in time, it still absolutely does make sense to electrify. We can also follow up if there's a specific question on actual numbers. We can follow up with the two carbon emission impacts of the two types of vehicles as well.
Great, thanks, Katrina. For Brian, what type of retrofits have the greatest impact on carbon reductions for larger buildings?
So the number one thing is decarbonization of the heating system. So for the very large majority of large buildings, they're heated with natural gas using boilers, and that is their largest source of energy and emissions in those buildings. So looking at either partially or fully replacing that with heat pumps, whether it's air source heat pumps or ground source heat pumps, is the most impactful retrofit measure, followed by doing the same with domestic hot water, or the hot water that's used in the buildings. also primarily gas heated and the second largest source of energy and emissions in buildings. And so it's yeah, that fuel switching retrofits for heating and hot water is the biggest impact. And then after that, it goes down to improving the envelope as well as improving electrical efficiency in various parts of the building. But by far the biggest ones are addressing the heating and hot water system.
Great. Thanks, Brian. Maybe another question for you, Brian. Do we know whether the IESO, the Independent Electricity System Operator, is considering fuel switching in their demand projections as they've done for electric vehicles?
So the answer is a qualified yes. So they are factoring in some fuel switching for heating in their demand projections. But those assumptions are pretty modest. So it amounts to sort of in the latest projections we saw, assuming that a share, not the entirety, but a share of new construction goes with electricity instead of natural gas. And basically that there would be marginal, if any, fuel switching in existing homes and buildings, but that small and growing share of new construction would electrify. So I would say it's a pretty conservative assessment in there about the pace of electrification of heating. Just pausing if my colleagues might have, better understanding of that than me, but I think I captured it.
Yeah, thanks, Brian. And I think that just speaks to the amount of uncertainty there is that underpins those demand forecasts. And so we're kind of waiting and seeing what sort of climate policies emerge to support those electrification efforts. Okay, so maybe a question for Katrina. This one I think might require a bit of a complex answer, but can this data be used as evidence to show the relationship between urban sprawl and emissions?
That's a good question. So at the moment, we don't specifically identify and track what kind of emission impact certain areas of growth in urban, whether it's urban sprawl or not, what kind of impact they have on the inventory. Overall, I think if we were looking at total emissions, but also normalized for population, we can get potentially a decent trend. Just thinking out loud here and brainstorming based on sort of specific regions, because we can get down to somewhat of a specific level in terms of utility usage, so electricity and natural gas. So that's something that we could look at in the future. Absolutely. We'll put it on the list for future improvements.
Great. Okay. I think we probably have time for one more question, and apologies to anyone that I didn't get to. Does TAF ever retroactively update past year's inventories when, for example, emissions factors change with better science? And I think there are probably a number of reasons why we might change past estimates in previous years. But maybe I'll hand this one over to Pat.
Sure, thanks, Akash. And the answer to that question is yes. Each year's inventory includes historical emissions going back to 2015. And for sure, if there's any methodological change that might come about for whatever reason, we always go back and make sure it's applied consistently. So we always have an apples to apples comparison between years. And also just a quick plug from the website, there is a pretty comprehensive methodology document available for download as well that really goes into some detail there. So you can definitely check that out for some more info on that.
Great. Thanks so much, Pat. And thanks to all of our panelists for answering all those questions and for your insights. And thanks to all of you for attending our webinar here. As I mentioned, the slides and the recording of the webinar will be made available after this presentation via email. And we will be publishing an exit poll, which should be popping up shortly. So please do fill that out. It gives us a lot to think about and reflect on for next year's webinar. So that concludes the webinar focused on our 2023 inventory. Please do check out the website and do reach out if you have any questions about the inventory or whether we can support you drive climate action in your respective municipalities. So thanks very much and have a great week.